Picture a weary cowboy hunched beside a crackling campfire, under an endless canopy of stars as a pot of something bubbles over the flames. When we think of cowboy food, most of us imagine beans and coffee, maybe some beef jerky and hard biscuits. But the reality of what cowboys ate on the trail was far more complex and surprisingly diverse than Hollywood would have us believe, from ingenious preservation methods to wild game hunts and the all-important chuck wagon. Join us as we uncover the truth about what really sustained these legendary figures of the Old West and discover the meals that fueled the greatest cattle drives in American history, the reality of cowboy cuisine. The call of the open range was irresistible to thousands of young men in the latter half of the 19th century, promising adventure, freedom, opportunity, and a chance to make their mark on the untamed frontier. But while the romance of cowboy life captured imaginations across America, the daily reality was far grittier than the dime novel suggested, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the realm of food. Cowboys spent months on cattle drives covering over 1,000 miles from Texas to railheads in Kansas, Missouri, and beyond. During these grueling journeys, which could last 3 to 4 months, the men faced scorching heat, torrential rains, dangerous river crossings, and the constant threat of stampedes. In such harsh conditions, food wasn't just sustenance, it was survival. It was morale. It was the difference between a successful drive and complete disaster. The cowboy diet was shaped by 3 crucial factors: practicality, durability, and cost. Everything had to be portable, non-perishable, or easily preserved, and cheap enough for ranch owners to provide for crews of 10 to 15 hungry men. What emerged was a cuisine born of necessity, a fascinating blend of frontier ingenuity, borrowed culinary traditions, and pure stubborn determination to make something edible out of limited ingredients. Remember to hit the like button because it helps us a lot. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and press the notification bell to not miss the upcoming interesting videos. The Chuck Wagon, mobile kitchen of the plains. At the heart of every successful cattle drive was an invention that revolutionized life on the trail: the chuck wagon. This mobile kitchen was more than just a wagon. It was a lifeline, a social hub, and the most important piece of equipment on any drive. The chuck wagon was invented in 1866 by Charles Goodnight, a legendary cattleman who modified a sturdy army surplus wagon to meet the specific needs of his cowboys. Goodnight installed a large box at the rear of the wagon with drawers and compartments for storing food, cooking utensils, and supplies. This chuck box featured a hinged lid that folded down to create a workspace where the cook could prepare meals. The design was so practical that it remained virtually unchanged for decades. A typical wagon was stocked with 500 pounds of flour, 200 pounds of beans, 100 pounds of potatoes, 100 pounds of dried fruit, 50 pounds of coffee, 25 pounds of sugar, 10 pounds of salt, and various quantities of rice lard baking soda, dried beef bacon, and occasionally canned goods. The underside of the wagon featured a cowhide sling called a possum belly, which held cow chips and firewood for cooking. Fire's water barrels were mounted on the sides, providing access to fresh water during the day when the wagon train stopped for the evening. The chuck wagon became the focal point of camp. The cook would set up his Dutch ovens and cooking equipment, creating a makeshift kitchen in the wilderness. The smell of coffee brewing and food cooking drew the tired cowboys like moths. To a flame, the chuck wagon represented order, civilization, and comfort in an otherwise harsh existence. Cowboys would spread their bedrolls in a semicircle around the wagon, using it as a windbreak and gathering spot. Strict etiquette meant that cowboys never walked between the fire and the chuck box, never helped themselves to food without the cook's permission, and always cleaned their plates immediately after eating. Beans, the cowboy's best friend. If there's one food item that defines cowboy cuisine, it's beans. Pinto beans, specifically, were the undisputed staple of the trail diet, and for good reason. Dried beans were lightweight, easy to transport, incredibly filling, and packed with protein, making them the perfect food for men engaged in exhausting physical labor. Day after day, a single pound of dried beans could be purchased for mere pennies, yet provided enough nutrition to sustain multiple cowboys for a meal. The beans were typically soaked in water throughout the day as the chuck wagon bounced along the trail. This soaking process rehydrated the beans and reduced cooking time. Once camp was made for the evening, the beans were transferred to a Dutch oven, along with salt pork bacon, or whatever meat was available. Water and seasonings then buried in hot coals to cook slowly for hours. The result was a thick, hearty stew that stuck to the ribs. Cowboys ate beans for breakfast, lunch, and dinner without complaint because they understood that beans meant survival. Some trail cooks developed signature bean recipes that became legendary among the men. One popular preparation involved cooking beans with chunks of salt pork, chili peppers, and wild onions, creating a spicy, flavorful dish that brought some excitement to the monotonous trail diet. Another method involved adding molasses or brown sugar to create a sweeter version similar to modern baked beans. The beauty of beans lay in their versatility. They could be mashed and fried into cakes mixed with cornmeal to make corn dodgers, or simply served alongside other foods as a reliable side dish. Cowboys even developed their own slang around beans, referring to them as prairie strawberries or whistleberries, a humorous acknowledgement of their unfortunate digestive side effects. However, beans did have drawbacks. They required significant water for both soaking and cooking, which could be scarce in arid regions. They also had to be consumed relatively quickly after cooking, since without refrigeration, cooked beans would spoil within a day or two in hot weather. Despite these limitations, beans remained the most dependable and economical food source on the trail. The nutritional value of beans cannot be overstated. They provided essential fiber, protein, iron, and other nutrients that helped prevent scurvy and other deficiency diseases that plagued travelers in the 19th century. While the cowboy diet was far from balanced, beans formed the nutritional foundation that kept these men alive and working through months of grueling cattle drives. Beef and meat. More than you'd think. It might seem paradoxical that men whose job was herding cattle wouldn't eat beef regularly, but the economics of the cattle drive meant that killing a steer for food was generally avoided. The cattle being driven represented the ranch owner's investment and profit. Every animal lost to hunger, predators, disease, or consumption reduced the overall earnings of the drive. As a result, cowboys primarily relied on other sources of meat, with fresh beef being a rare treat reserved for special occasions when an animal was injured during the drive, or when the trail boss decided to reward the men for good work. A steer might be slaughtered. The event was treated almost like a celebration with the cook, preparing fresh steaks, roasts, and organ meats. The cowboys would feast, knowing that such abundance was temporary. Fresh beef that couldn't be consumed immediately was quickly processed into jerky, thin strips of meat, were heavily salted and either smoked over a low fire or dried in the sun. This preservation method had been used for centuries by Native American tribes. Beef jerky was ideal for the trail, lightweight, portable, and packed with protein. The jerking process could transform a 200-pound steer into about 40 pounds of preserved meat that would last for weeks. More common than beef was salt pork, also called sowbelly. This heavily salted preserved pork appeared in nearly every meal. The cook would slice off portions as needed, frying them to render the fat, which was then used for cooking other foods. Bacon was considered a luxury item compared to salt pork when available. It was rationed carefully. The rendered bacon grease was saved religiously and used for frying eggs, cooking biscuits, and adding flavor to bland dishes. Nothing was wasted on the trail when cattle were slaughtered. Cowboys made use of every edible part. The tongue, heart, liver, and other organ meats were considered delicacies. The most famous preparation was son of a gun stew. This dish combined pieces of beef, heart, liver, tongue, brains, and the prized marrow gut, creating a rich, flavorful stew that utilized parts of the animal that would otherwise go to waste. Bread and biscuits, sourdough staples, bread in various forms provided essential carbohydrates and helped make the bean and meat-heavy diet more palatable. But creating bread on the trail presented unique challenges without the convenience of commercial yeast. Cowboys relied on sourdough starter, a mixture of flour, water, and wild yeast captured from the environment, to leaven their bread. The sourdough starter was the cook's most precious possession. Treated with almost superstitious reverence, it lived in a crock or jar kept warm near the cook's bedroll at night, and carefully fed with flour and water to keep the yeast cultures alive and active. Some sourdough starters were passed down through generations, with cooks taking pride in starters that were decades old. Losing the starter, whether to freezing temperatures, accidents, or theft, was considered a catastrophe that could ruin a cattle drive. The most common bread product was sourdough biscuits. These were made by combining sourdough starter with flour, lard, salt, and sometimes a bit of sugar or baking soda. The dough was kneaded, briefly rolled out, and cut into rounds, which were then placed in a greased Dutch oven. The Dutch oven was positioned over hot coals, with additional coals placed on the lid, creating an improvised oven that baked the biscuits to golden perfection in about 20 to 30 minutes. Fresh, hot sourdough biscuits were a highlight of the trail diet. Their tangy flavor and satisfying texture provided comfort and a sense of normalcy in the harsh conditions. Cowboys would slather them with butter when available or use them to soak up bean juice and meat drippings. Another bread variation was pan de campo, which translates to camp bread. This simple unleavened bread required only flour, salt, lard, and water mixed into a dough, kneaded until smooth, rolled flat, and cooked in a Dutch oven. Pan de campo was faster to prepare than sourdough biscuits, since it didn't require rising time, making it ideal when the crew needed to eat quickly and get back on the trail. The bread was dense and filling, if somewhat bland, but it served its purpose admirably. Corn dodgers were another popular bread item made from cornmeal water or milk salt, and sometimes a bit of bacon grease. The mixture was formed into small cakes and fried in a skillet or baked in a Dutch oven. Corn dodgers were especially common in the southern ranges, where corn was more readily available than wheat. The name supposedly originated from the need to dodge the hard, crusty dodgers when they were tossed from the cook to the cowboys during mealtime when supplies ran low, or when wheat flour was unavailable. Cowboys made do with hardtack, also known as hot rocks. These rock-hard crackers were made from flour, water, and salt, baked multiple times until completely desiccated. Hardtack had been a military staple during the Civil War, and many former soldiers were already familiar with it. While nearly indestructible and long-lasting hardtack was also nearly inedible. In its dry state, cowboys would soak it in coffee water or bean juice to soften it enough to chew. Some men preferred to crumble it into soups and stews rather than attempt to eat it. Whole, coffee, black as night, strong as death. If beans were the food that sustained cowboys, then coffee was the fuel that drove them. The importance of coffee in cowboy culture cannot be overstated. It was the first thing consumed in the morning, often before sunrise, and the last thing drunk before bedding down for the night. Coffee provided warmth, comfort, and a powerful dose of caffeine that helped exhausted men face another day of hard work. Cowboys preferred their coffee strong, brutally strong by modern standards. A common recipe called for 2 pounds of Arbuckle's coffee, the most popular brand on the frontier, mixed with enough water to wet it down. Then boiled for 2 hours, the resulting brew was thick, dark, and bitter, capable of floating a horseshoe. As the saying went, no cream or sugar diluted this potent concoction. Cowboys drank it black, embracing its harsh, bitter flavor as part of the trail experience. The coffee pot was always the first item set up when camp was made, and it remained on the fire continuously, with fresh grounds added to the old ones throughout the day. This practice created an ever stronger brew that accumulated a thick layer of grounds at the bottom of the pot. Seasoned cowboys knew to drink slowly and carefully to avoid getting a mouthful of grounds. Arbuckle's Ariosa coffee dominated the cowboy coffee market for good reason. Each package came with a stick of peppermint candy and coupons that could be redeemed for various goods. This created an incentive system where the cowboy who volunteered to grind the coffee beans got to keep the peppermint, a rare treat that made the tedious grinding task more appealing. The grinding itself was done by hand using a coffee mill attached to the side of the chuck wagon or by placing beans in a cloth sack and crushing them with a rock or the butt of a rifle coffee, served multiple purposes beyond simple refreshment. It helped counteract the effects of monotonous diet, poor water quality, and exhaustion. It provided a ritual that marked the beginning and end of each day, creating a sense of routine and normalcy. The act of gathering around the campfire with a cup of coffee fostered camaraderie and gave cowboys a chance to share stories, complain about the day's hardships, and bond as a crew. Interestingly, coffee was one of the few items that cowboys might purchase with their own money, if the ranch supplies ran short. Men who had developed a dependence on caffeine during the drive would gladly spend precious wages to maintain their coffee supply, testimony to just how essential this beverage had become to trail life, preserved foods, salt, smoke, and survival. Without refrigeration or canning facilities, preserving meat for the long cattle drives required methods that had been used for centuries. Salting, smoking, and drying transformed fresh meat into shelf-stable provisions that could last for months. Salt pork was perhaps the most important preserved meat on the trail. The preservation process involved packing fresh pork in layers of salt within wooden barrels. The salt drew moisture out of the meat through osmosis, creating an environment where bacteria could not survive. After several weeks, the pork was fully cured and could be stored at room temperature indefinitely. The resulting product was extremely salty, requiring soaking before cooking, but it provided reliable protein when no other options existed. Bacon underwent a similar preservation process, but with additional smoking to add flavor and further inhibit bacterial growth. Slabs of pork belly were salt-cured, then hung in a smokehouse where they were exposed to cool smoke from hardwood fires for days or even weeks. This smoking process not only preserved the meat, but also imparted a distinctive smoky flavor that made bacon more palatable than plain salt pork. Beef jerky represented another crucial preservation method. Native Americans had been making pemmican and jerky for thousands of years, and cowboys adopted these techniques. Meat was sliced into thin strips about a quarter-inch thick, heavily salted and often seasoned with black pepper or chili powder. The strips were then either hung over a low smoky fire or draped over bushes to dry in the sun. The meat dried into dark, tough strips that could be sucked on or carefully chewed to extract flavor and nutrition. Properly made jerky could last for many months. Stored in cloth sacks hanging from the chuck wagon. Lard, rendered pig fat, was another essential preserved product that served multiple purposes. It was used as cooking fat for frying and baking, as a preservative for coating other foods, and even as a remedy for ailments from chapped lips to minor wounds. Lard remained stable for months, even in warm weather, providing concentrated calories essential for men burning 4,000 to 5,000 calories per day. Wild game and forage foods. While the chuck wagon provided staple foods, cowboys supplemented their diet by hunting wild game and foraging for edible plants along the trail. This not only added variety to the monotonous fare, but also provided fresh meat and vegetables that were otherwise unavailable. The Great Plains and Western Territories teemed with wildlife in the 19th century, making hunting a practical option. Buffalo, though already declining in numbers by the peak cowboy era, were occasionally hunted when encountered. Buffalo meat was lean, flavorful, and provided an enormous quantity of food. A single buffalo could feed an entire crew for days. The tongue was considered a particular delicacy, and the hump meat was prized for its tenderness. Deer and antelope were more common targets for cowboy hunters. These animals were plentiful throughout the West, and their meat integrated easily into the standard trail diet. Venison could be prepared fresh or quickly jerked for later consumption. Wild turkey, prairie chickens, quail, and other game birds offered a welcome change from red meat. These birds were relatively easy to hunt and could be roasted over the campfire or added to stews. Rabbit and squirrel, though smaller, were abundant and easily trapped, providing quick meals when larger game was unavailable. Some cowboys looked down on eating small game, but hunger has a way of overcoming such prejudices. Fish from rivers and streams offered another protein source. Catfish, geese, and trout all found their way into the frying pan. Foraging for edible plants required knowledge that many cowboys lacked, but experienced trail hands knew what to look for. Wild onions were common across the plains, and added much-needed flavor to bland dishes. Wild garlic, mustard greens, and various edible roots supplemented the diet with vitamins and minerals. Prickly pear cactus provided both fruit and edible pads. Mesquite beans could be ground into flour or eaten whole. Pecans, walnuts, and other nuts were gathered when available, providing protein and healthy fats. Wild berries, including blackberries and dewberries, were prized discoveries. Cowboys would gather these by the handful, eating them fresh or bringing them back to camp, where the cook might make a pie or cobbler. Such treats were rare but memorable. Dried fruits and sweets, rare treats on the trail. In a diet dominated by meat, beans, and bread, anything sweet was a treasured luxury. Dried fruits provided one of the few reliable sources of sweetness, and were considered essential supplies for any well-equipped chuck wagon. Apples were the most common dried fruit carried on cattle drives. Apple orchards were widespread across America, and drying apples was a well-established preservation method. Thin apple slices were dried in the sun or in low ovens until they became leathery and shelf-stable. These dried apples were stewed in water with sugar when available, creating a compote that could be eaten as is or used as pie-filling. Dried apricots, though more expensive than apples, were highly prized for their intense sweetness and bright flavor. They rehydrated well and provided a burst of color and taste that contrasted sharply with the browns and grays of typical cowboy food. Peaches, plums, and cherries were also dried when available, creating a variety of options for the trail cook. Prunes, dried plums, were valued not just for their sweetness, but for their laxative properties, which helped counteract the constipating effects of a diet heavy in meat and beans. Cowboys might joke about prunes, but they appreciated the digestive relief they provided. Raisins were another common dried fruit, carried in cloth sacks and eaten by the handful as snacks or added to baked goods for sweetness. They were lightweight, required no preparation, and provided quick energy, making them ideal for men working long hours in the saddle. When dried fruits were stewed, they transformed into something approaching a dessert. The cook would simmer them in water, sometimes adding sugar, cinnamon, or other spices if available, until they softened and released their sweetness. This fruit compote, called simply stewed fruit, was served in the evening after the main meal, giving cowboys something to look forward to. Dried fruit pies represented the pinnacle of chuck wagon desserts. When the cook had timed dried fruit and the inclination to impress the crew, he might make a pie using sourdough or biscuit dough for the crust, dried apples or peaches for the filling, and whatever sweetener was available. These pies were baked in Dutch ovens, buried in coals, creating a dessert that rivaled anything found in town restaurants. Molasses was another source of sweetness on the trail. This thick, dark syrup made from sugarcane was less expensive than refined sugar and served multiple purposes. It sweetened coffee, baked goods, and beans, and could be eaten directly on biscuits or bread. Some cowboys developed a taste for molasses that lasted their entire lives. Sugar, when available, was carefully rationed and used sparingly. White refined sugar was expensive and considered something of a luxury. Most sugar on the trail was brown sugar, which retained some molasses content and had a richer flavor. Cookies or cakes were rare treats reserved for special occasions like branding celebrations or the end of a successful cattle drive. Regional variations, Mexican and native influences. The cowboy diet was not uniform across the American West. Regional variations reflected the cultural influences of different areas, particularly in the Southwest, where Mexican vaquero traditions heavily influenced Anglo-cowboy culture in Texas, and the territories stretching toward California. Mexican and Tejano cowboys brought their culinary traditions to the trail, introducing foods that would become staples of cowboy cuisine. Chili con carne, a spicy stew of meat and chili peppers, was a Mexican contribution that became synonymous with cowboy food. Texas. Cowboys adopted and adapted this dish, creating their own versions that typically eschewed beans in favor of more meat and plenty of chili powder. The debate over whether authentic chili should contain beans continues to this day. Tortillas offered an alternative to biscuits and were preferred by Mexican cowboys. These thin flatbreads made from corn or wheat flour were cooked on a flat griddle called a comal and used to scoop up beans or wrap around meat fajitas. though not called by that name until much later, were created when Mexican cowboys grilled less desirable cuts of beef, like skirt steak, over open fires when sliced and served with tortillas, peppers, and onions. They created a flavorful meal from meat that might otherwise be discarded. Tamales wrapped parcels of masa dough, filled with meat and steamed in corn husks, provided a portable filling meal that could be eaten cold. Carne guisada, a Mexican-style beef stew, featured meat, simmered with tomatoes, peppers, onions, and spices, creating rich, flavorful dishes that contrasted with blander Anglo-style stews. Native American contributions to cowboy cuisine, though less often acknowledged, were equally significant. Pemmican, a concentrated food made from dried meat, pounded fat, and sometimes berries, was adopted by some trail hands as an ultra-portable, high-calorie food. Succotash, combining corn and beans, reflected Native American agricultural traditions. Various methods of preparing corn, including hominy and pozole, were borrowed from indigenous peoples and incorporated into chuck wagon cooking. French-Canadian trappers in the northern plains introduced pea soup, and their methods of preserving meat also influenced cowboy food preparation techniques. The cook's power, more important than the trail boss. The chuck wagon cook held a position of unique importance in the cattle drive hierarchy, while the trail boss commanded overall authority and made decisions about route and cattle management. The cook wielded tremendous power over daily life. His domain, the chuck wagon and the area around the campfire, was sacrosanct, and even the trail boss thought twice before interfering. The cook typically received higher wages than regular cowboys, reflecting his specialized skills and critical role. A good cook could make a difficult cattle drive bearable, while a poor one could lead to low morale disputes and even desertion. His ability to create palatable meals from limited ingredients, manage supplies to last the entire journey, and maintain his equipment under challenging conditions required experience, skill, and creativity. The cook's day began before dawn, often 2 to 3 hours before the cowboys needed to rise. He started the fire-prepared coffee and began cooking breakfast, which might include biscuits, bacon, or salt pork beans, and perhaps fried potatoes throughout the day. As the chuck wagon moved along the trail, the cook managed his supplies and planned the evening meal. The noon meal was typically cold leftovers or simple foods like jerky and biscuits, but the evening meal was the main event of the day. The cook's responsibilities extended beyond food preparation. He often served as the crew's barber, dentist, and medic, treating minor injuries and illnesses with limited medical supplies. He maintained and repaired the wagon itself, and kept careful inventory to prevent running short before reaching the next supply point. Cowboys learned quickly to stay on the cook's good side. They helped with chores like gathering firewood without being asked, and never criticized the food. No matter how unappetizing a cowboy who angered the cook might find his portion smaller, his coffee weaker, and his biscuits burned. Insulting the cook's food was considered grounds for dismissal from the crew. Some cooks developed legendary reputations, their skills becoming known throughout the cattle country, and their stories told and retold around campfires, becoming part of cowboy folklore. The truth behind the campfire. The reality of cowboy cuisine bears little resemblance to the romantic images portrayed in Western films and novels. The diet was monotonous, limited by necessity, and shaped entirely by the demands of survival in harsh conditions. Yet within these constraints, a unique food culture emerged that reflected the diverse influences of the American frontier. Cowboys ate beans, not because they were delicious, but because they were practical. They drank bitter coffee, not for enjoyment, but for the warmth and caffeine it provided. They treasured their cook, not because he was a culinary artist, but because he kept them fed and alive through months of grueling work. The chuck wagon meals shared around the campfire became more than simple sustenance. They were moments of community and connection in an otherwise isolating existence. The food itself became laden with meaning. Sourdough biscuits represented civilization and care in the wilderness. Strong coffee symbolized toughness and endurance. Fresh meat signified celebration and abundance. The cowboy diet also tells a broader story about American expansion and cultural exchange. The blending of Anglo-Mexican and Native American foodways created something new, a frontier cuisine born of necessity that would eventually influence American food culture more broadly. Chili con carne beef jerky, coffee culture, and outdoor cooking traditions all trace their roots to the chuck wagons of the 19th century. For the men who lived it, the reality was less romantic than we imagine today. They endured hunger, monotony, and questionable food quality as routine parts of their work. Yet they persevered, creating a legacy that continues to capture our imagination. The next time you enjoy a bowl of chili or gather around a campfire with friends, remember the cowboys who made similar meals under far more challenging circumstances, and perhaps gain a new appreciation for both the hardships they endured and the traditions they created. Please like and share. If you find the video content interesting and useful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment below so as not to miss the upcoming interesting videos. Thanks for watching.